All right. Hey, everybody. Welcome once again to the Winning Digital Customers podcast. I have another great friend of mine with us today, David Gitow. He is a long tenured veteran of the publishing industry. He spent many years a senior role at Time Inc. He's been with Hearst. Most recently, he was responsible for the direct-to-consumer business with Highlights Magazine, a memory from my youth, I don't know how long Highlights Magazine's been around, but it's a long, long time playing a key role in education of young people. He's also did a stint as a chief digital marketing officer for Ashford.com. In fact, if I just tried to describe all of his experience, I'd probably run out the clock on our podcast today. So I'll stop there, but I'm really excited to get into it with David because he is not only a longtime veteran of the publishing industry, but of the digital transformation of publishing industry. So David, welcome, and anything you want to add to my attempt to introduce you with all of your tremendous experience?
No, Howard, I think you did a great job. Everyone just reading it that I've been around a long time and I'm old.
No, I didn't say that. Yeah, I know, I'm getting on myself. Well, you know what? The upside of us old guys is we have seen and done a lot. So that's why we're here, to try to have some conversations about what we've learned over time. So, gosh, so many different angles we could get into, but clearly the story of publishing in recent decades has been the story of the move to digital. And although, having said that, there's obviously still a business. I published a book myself, and we've sold thousands and thousands of copies in print. And so, and personally, if I have to choose, I'd rather someone buy the print version because I know it's going to sit on their desk or sit in their bookshelf instead of get lost in a list of hundreds of items on their Kindle. So I'm a fan of print. And at the same time, clearly, we've seen the decline in favor of lower cost and more convenient distribution channels. So maybe just start there. I'd love you just, how do you view this, how publishing has had to evolve and adapt and kind of, I don't know, there have been successes and there have been huge failures. What's your perspective kind of looking back at how publishing has handled the digital revolution?
Yeah, I think, Howard, it's been mind-boggling for a lot of us who go way back to Time Inc., where we started, and a lot of us grew up with Time, Sports Illustrated, People, Life, Entertainment Weekly a long time ago. And back then, print was dominant. We had 4,600,000 people got Time magazine, 12 million people got Reader's Digest. It was just enormous numbers. And I remember late 80s, and this was kind of the beginning, late 80s, this new thing came about, which was starting to challenge our current business. It was called cable TV, if you remember, late 80s. And all of a sudden, people were getting news, not every week when we wanted to give it to them, but they were starting to get news every day. So we had to begin to rethink the content to say, well, if everyone is burnt out on the latest news story, Will Smith, for example, if you saw that on Saturday and our issue wasn't coming out till Friday and you'd already seen as much as you could handle, what was news in that shape? And sports and all these different arenas, ESPN came up. So that was really the beginning of shifts of content. And the other big thing was those articles were enormously long. So what happened was that sound bites, that became a word, sound bites. And so content, not only did you have more competitors, but the type of content started to get shorter and quicker. And then with the advent of the internet, whenever let's say around 2000, late 90s, that got even more rapid. So content's gotten shorter. If you notice, your articles are much, much shorter. They're more bite-sized. And the whole world has changed, and news information on anything you want is everywhere. So the question is, what do you do if you're a magazine? And a lot of magazines weren't up to the challenge. And there's been enormous change in the industry. Time Inc., which was the dominant publisher, is gone for the most part. They're now a byline in Meredith or a dot dash. So they're completely different. Sports Illustrated is completely, totally different. And a lot of publications just no longer do print editions. So it's been a fascinating transformation. Sad for a lot of us that were back there in the heyday. But, when we look back, we say, why? Why did this happen? And there are two key factors. One is advertising. And the beauty of magazines and a lot of print content, newspapers, et cetera, was that they were 70% ad revenue, and ad revenue is at 80% margins, 75, 80% margins. All of a sudden, when now new advertising mediums came up that were new shiny pennies for a lot of advertisers, or they reached a different market on a more targeted basis, all of a sudden that advertising dollar shifted, really hurting magazines. And at the same time, you had the delivery of content in new and different ways. So that really changed the game. And magazines, all they did really, and this is sad, is they would just take the print edition, put up a PDF onto a website, or send that to customers. And that consisted being in the internet game. And I really do think that stalled for a long time magazines' ability to recognize, wait a second, what is the content we deliver? What is the content in this new world people want? How should we deliver it? And making changes in the way they distributed the content and what the content was. So I think that was a major change and a very poor recognition on the magazine world and publishing world's part to really recognize this is a new medium. What do we do in the new medium?
Yeah. And I want to dive into that more. But before I do, I'm curious if you have a prognosis for print. I know I saw a study recently that showed that after obviously massive declines, that over the last few years, the number of consumer print magazines has been ticking up just a teeny tiny bit over the last few years. And it almost looks like, I don't know, I'm curious of what your view on this, but it has print maybe flatlined, but is there a long-term future for print as a way of getting news and lifestyle content and things like that out? Or are we just on a momentary plateau on the way down, and ultimately print as a means for delivering that kind of content is going the way, of the 8-track tape, the telex, et cetera?
Personally, I think, as sad as it is, it's got about 20 years left, 20, 25 years. I think if you actually, I used to do this in the office when I was at Hearst, and I was in charge of digital marketing of Hearst newspapers. And we'd go around to all these people who were working on print editions. And I would say to pretty much anyone under 35, who gets the print edition? Nobody read it. So I think it's going to be folks who grew up and are very comfortable in a digital world and just focus themselves that way. Once they are 60, 65, that's when I think print is going to go. So I think there's a lot of us that love print, grew up on print, are facile with it. I think over time, once those people are not the key part of the market anymore or not able to sustain it, they're going to all start to transfer over to digital. And
I've heard it said that, I'm sorry, go ahead, finish that.
Sorry, I just think, it started with cable TV and now it's digital. I just don't see the ability to sustain print and physically print and go through those costs. It's tough. Also, the other thing which is very interesting when you look at the Wall Street Journal and New York Times. If you read about them, they're flourishing right now. They're doing spectacularly well. And what they did was they recognized very early that they could create content and that it would be in demand and not go away. So they were able to maintain and bolster their news-making organizations. But the thing that happened, and I don't think enough publishers have realized it. So for the New York Times and Wall Street Journal, what happened for them was a lot of the restrictions that being a print format had to get a subscription to someone in Idaho, to get a subscription to someone in Malaysia. There was no way. It was too expensive and no one was going to subscribe. All of a sudden, through digital, now the opportunity, it created a worldwide opportunity. And they've taken advantage of it and have it bolstered their news-making organizations globally. And their digital subscriptions are far, far, far bigger than it ever was as print. So for them, it's been a great thing having digital, but I don't think a lot of other publishers have said, okay, what does this new medium allow us to do? Time Magazine, what does it allow us to do? All of a sudden, instead of having 6 global editions, you could have had, and if you'd done it earlier and installed it, a very powerful global weekly news commentary that was thoughtful. They could have probably done things a lot faster. Sports as well. Sports Illustrated could have become a global sports entity, a global sports brand, and brought news and information that way.
Yeah. Oh, that makes tons of sense. I mean, I remember being in my 20s when I still had a print subscription to the New York Times, and that Sunday Times would come, and I mean that thing weighed 6 pounds. You know,
right?
That was
right.
To think about shipping something like that to London or whatever else would seem. I can totally see how would be extraordinarily expensive, let alone the time. So no, that I think that makes good sense. And just to go back for a sec to what you were saying about the older generations. I mean, I'm with you. I did a whole live cast last year about ebooks and asserting the view, which I don't think is a commonly held view today, which is that printed books have essentially 20 years left as a mainstream. Very much what you said, the 20-year number, you know, and I gave a whole bunch of reasons why I thought very detailed analysis. We'll see if I'm right, but I put myself out there and said printed books are on the way out, except as, you know, I'm sure there's always an edge case, right? There's always somebody who still uses I mean, my son plays, you know, LP albums sometimes out of nostalgia and whatnot. Right. So there's always the edge case, but that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about, you know, that kind of mainstream. Is it a dominant media method of distributing something? And I think it's safe to say that LP records, vinyl is not a mainstream method of delivering music, even if it's still accessible. Yeah.
Yeah. It's a fun niche thing.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. And, you know, what you said about the age, I think that's right. I think one of the points that I made back then was it does seem like, you know, those that are most interested in these print mediums, and it makes sense, are those that grew up with them, that tend to be older. So you have this older crowd until they reach the age where they want the print to get bigger.
Yes.
And then all of a sudden, even to them, the digital starts to look pretty darn good because we don't have, I don't think, the Reader's Digest large type edition anymore. And this fundamental ability, and this is one of the dozen or so reasons, as simple as it is, but the ability to change the type size in digital publications becomes very, very important for people who start to experience, obviously at any age, you might have this issue, but certainly with older people, reduced vision and the desire not to have to always wear your reading glasses becomes a reason to go to digital as well.
You know, and Howard, I think there's one other thing which the new generation does differently than the older generation does, which I think is interesting. I kind of coined them. I don't like Gen Z or Gen X or what. I don't know the difference between them, and it's a lot of alphabetical confusion. But I call them the on-demand generation. So, folks, when I look at my daughter, when I look at folks in their 20s, they have grown up getting what they want when they want to get it. They are less programmed. They don't think of TV. We sit there and look at what's on tonight. What is the broadcast station giving us tonight? What's HBO giving us tonight? They don't think that way. They think on demand. And so that's very much, if you have a kid in their teens, they sit up in their room and they watch what they want to watch when they want to watch it. They shop for what they want when they want it. It's delivered right to wherever they want. And so with print and newspapers, same thing. They will go and seek the news. They'll look at what's on their homepage, perhaps, or coming through their Facebook feed or their Apple feed or whatever feed they are. But they get news on demand. They're less oriented to read what the New York Times or Wall Street Journal are providing. They'll go and seek out the news story of the day. You know, what happened with Will Smith?
I experienced this in my own home. Just yesterday, my son was at the computer, my 9-year-old son Joseph, playing Roblox, and all of a sudden I hear from the next room, "Dad, waffles." You know, what? Yep, need some waffles. You know?
Yeah,
so that's that on-demand generation, right?
Right. And so the question is, how does that translate into content, print, all that? It means you're going to have to make it searchable and accessible. You're going to need to get into other people's feeds. That's going to be critical. Yeah. You're going to need to have content out there. You hear top of the funnel, that's how content's going to be delivered, top of the funnel, and then they draw you down.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about that. That's interesting. You mentioned things like Apple News, and we saw, of course, when iTunes came out, the sort of the disaggregation of the album into the song, right? And now with TiVo and other kind of on-demand methods of watching shows, I think we've seen to some degree the disaggregation of the channel. There's a lot of people who say, "Oh, I have to go home and watch Bridgerton." Well, what's Bridgerton on? I don't know. It's on my Apple TV, right? Or it's on my Kindle Fire Stick or whatever else. But it's been made so easy to just find the show that it becomes less important to know, which service it's on. And I'm wondering, are you seeing the same thing with essentially magazine articles? And if so, because more and more people, instead of going to news providers, are going to Google News or going to Apple News or some sort of aggregator with personalization, or just Twitter, Facebook, places like that, which essentially also serve as personalized news platforms for better or for worse. What have you observed in terms of that change, and what does it mean for someone like a Time or even a Highlights, a magazine that has that kind of classic content?
Yeah, well, I think Google is still the predominant method of searching for news. And so one of the big questions for anyone who's in the content distribution business is, how good am I at getting recognized by Google? Because I think that's your first wall of defense for searching for on demand. But then you have to be good at, and you have to be organized to make sure that your content is being fed through the major distributors, Apple, Facebook. Facebook is enormously powerful. They're going through trouble right now. A little worried about Facebook because of all the privacy rules. But Apple, I think, has done a good job, but isn't the first place people go, I don't think, because I don't think there's nothing you look at Apple on a daily basis like you do at Facebook. Facebook, you are there all day long. If you're a Facebook person, you're there all day long and you look at your feed. Apple, I'm not sure they have that same sort of natural affinity to the customer. You have to kind of go, or you put on your news feed, but it's not a go-to daily activity. I think it's a little bit more of an effort. And so the question is, will there be more of that over time emerging? There aren't that many more news organizations that have a go-to sort of where you're going to go to that news organization very rapidly unless you want to subscribe. Local is different, though, because I think there is a lot with local newspapers. I worked for Hearst for a few years in their newspaper division. And each one of the newspapers, San Francisco Chronicle, Houston Chronicle, had very, very strong, well-received digital newspapers. Or they had websites. And so with very good traffic. And I think that's a place that people go on a local level more frequently because that news, has to be curated for you. So there's a curation of news that I think works well on a local level and can be supported by advertising on a local level. So I think there's a lot of local news or local content which will do well over the long run. And I think the internet's an excellent medium for that because you can go through very easily, whereas most local newspapers are pretty bad. Once you get out of the New York metropolitan area and you look at some newspapers from out of town, out of the New York area, they're not the greatest newspapers. They generally take Associated Press or generally May News, cobble it together into a newspaper. But there's not as much in-depth reporting anymore. But when you have digital and you can get big numbers, I think you'll see a lot of flourishing of local news, local information, whereas it's harder on a national level to be able to support a huge organization.
Well, and I wonder, in the old days, people would get their national and international news from their local hometown paper, whether it's the Chicago Tribune or the Houston Chronicle or whatnot. But with the rise, as you've described already, of what really were initially fairly more local papers, even like the New York Times, becoming an international news organization, all of a sudden, does it become this bifurcated thing where we're not really looking to our local paper for national and international news? even if we're living somewhere totally different, we're still getting that from the New York Times or somebody like that, or from a non-traditional print provider like a Fox News or whatever. And then really it's left to the local papers just to focus on that kind of hyper-local content that someone like a New York Times wouldn't be interested in.
Exactly. I think the local will morph easily into digital, and they'll also be able to get an advertising base, which is key. The question is, can you get the advertising base and have that support the business? And I think local, there's always radio, still exists on a local level. That's because there is a base of advertising. I did, believe it or not, work for a radio station for a while, Cumulus, which is the number 2 in the market. And there is a very strong base of local businesses that need to reach the local community. And that has helped those radio stations stay. And not a lot of those have disappeared. They've been bought up and there's been a lot of consolidation. But they still do pretty well. And that's because those businesses haven't changed. You still need, your local business to reach a local customer. So that's been very interesting. It's more the national publications that have really had trouble, like an Entertainment Weekly sort of thing.
Yeah.
So,
although, I sorry, go ahead, finish.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say, although, it used to be, if you wanted to, if you placed an ad in a Time magazine, you were reaching a national audience. And if you didn't need a national audience, for example, you're just a local store in St. Louis, then that makes no sense because it's very expensive. So you want to be on a local print publication. And even many years ago, some of the large print publications did have some element of regional advertising. You can place an ad in some magazines and have it only appear on the West Coast or the East Coast to solve that problem. Still, it was pretty coarse. But of course now, with programmatic and with personalized advertising, is there in fact this break where there's nothing that stops Joe's Car Wash in Saskatchewan from advertising in the New York Times, because digitally it can still be targeted to only be seen by people who live within 10 miles of Saskatchewan, and all of a sudden he's in the New York Times, and so it becomes less important that local businesses are actually supporting local content.
Exactly, and that's a critical thing. I think one of the things that's changed in the media world is paywalls. In the beginning, so I've been in this since the very beginning. In the beginning, there was a huge debate. Do you have websites that have free content and you give it away free and it's an ad-supported model? And that's the way the news would work. But then over time, I think everybody realized it was hard to get enough money from advertisers digitally to make the business really work. So you had to go back to the consumer and say, okay, what if I give you more access, or if I continue to give you access, or give you more access? So it either could be to better and more detailed content, or it could just be like if you have ever looked at the Washington Post. You get your 6 articles a month, you get used to it, and then you want more, and you can't get it for the month. So you then think, well, okay, I'll subscribe and go beyond the paywall. So a lot of publishers have now discovered that a paywall can work. I can get the consumer to pay. But the big question for a lot of them, and I know having talked to them, is what is that content that I have to give to make a paywall work, to get someone to pay me for full-time access, a consumer? It's a subscription for sure. It's the same thing. It's just a different sort of content or access to something better. And that, and going back to the Hearst example, it was something we talked about all the time. We had print editions that were good. We had we had websites that had better content, but then we had the San Francisco Gate, which was free content, so ad supported. So we're going back and forth all the time. Should we have a paywall? Should we not? Should there be 2 separate things? And that was only 5-6 years ago. So even though internet is, 20, 25 years old, if you want to get to when it really is, the question is, it's still early. It's still early days. So a lot has performed. And I do think paywall, but the content has got to be valid and good. And so I think people will begin to say, what should we be? And if a good example is, if I want to grow an international audience, if my product is something that could go worldwide, Like, let's say you were in fishing or boating. There's no reason that you couldn't have a worldwide audience. The question is the content relevant to the worldwide audience? So can I open up demand on an international level and really take advantage? And that's what the Times and Journal have done really well. I still think for some publications, that's a big opportunity. But they may have to vary the content, which you can do on the internet.
So your view is because looking at something like the Times and the Journal, one could conclude, well, this is the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, so they can get away with the paywall, but can, boating news get away? But what I hear you saying is you believe that really is a viable business model if you're able to say, okay, we're a niche publication. We obviously don't have the level of interest of a New York Times, but on the other hand, if we aggregate together a global audience, we actually have a pretty big audience. And if we have quality content that really transcends what you can get for free, that there should be a paywall opportunity here, that this should be a common model, not just something that's only good for giant international brands.
Right. And the interesting thing about the internet too, without getting into too much of the business aspect, the marginal cost curve is extremely low on delivering that next subscription. So whether I have 10,000 subscriptions or I have 50,000, there's a cost of acquisition, but then once you deliver, it really doesn't cost you any more money. So you have a very, very attractive model for subscriptions when it comes to the question is the content. Is there an imperative to it, an urgency, or is there enough of it where I think if I'm an aficionado or I have a deep interest, yes, I should do this.
Well, that makes me want to ask, we're recording this just a few days after sort of an earthquake went through the news industry, which is, of course, CNN announced CNN Plus, a major strategic initiative, a paywall-driven news content option that I think cost, if I remember, something like $3 a month. It was envisioned to be, as you described, really international in scope, and they very aggressively promoted it. And all of a sudden, I started to see CNN.com started to feel like a commercial for CNN Plus. It seemed like half of the stuff that was being pushed to me when I went to CNN.com was going to send me to a registration to sign up for CNN Plus. And then the acquisition of CNN by Discovery Communications went through, and only a couple weeks after the launch of CNN Plus, I can't even imagine what cost they must have borne to launch that product. Must have been many tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars. It's now been killed and eliminated, and I think it's already gone. It was destroyed. It was halted almost within 24 hours of that. Any thoughts or insights about that massive change of direction? Because clearly you had people with a very different thinking around the paywall potential for an international news brand like CNN.
Yeah, that didn't. Well, I think this is a particular business case. CNN Plus, I always worried about from the get-go, just because there is so much news. There's almost too much news. And so, yes, you trust CNN. For them, from a business point of view, they're already creating the content for the TV network. They've already got international channels. So for them, it was taking all that content and modifying it for an internet channel. So for them, they had certain business advantages to it. But in terms of why do I need, I'm as news interested as anybody, and I never even gave it a remote thought, in terms of why would I need, do you have enough demand? And I think that in their early days, that's what they were seeing, is there was not enough demand for it. As part of a package, I think Discovery has enormous opportunity to package, and how the product eventually morphs, I don't know. But they have so much. They've got anchors of HBO and HBO Max for entertainment. At TBS, they've got tons of entertainment. Then they've got very specific interest, enormous amounts of specific interest. So I think they can become a formidable player over the long run. And one of the anchor points will be news too. So you get news all the time with CNN Plus. You get entertainment when you want it. You get great channels, Discovery channels, and you can see Swamp People and all that sort of stuff right in your home. So I think that will create a behemoth. That's my opinion, and my guess is it will create a behemoth in the how it all fits together, it's a little hard of a story to promote, but from a marketer's vantage point, but I think they'll figure it out. And I think they will have a very formidable, and so there'll be, the 3, 4, or 5 anchors that will be the streaming anchors, Disney for sure, and Netflix, and then there'll be 4 or 5 others, and there'll be more consolidation, and eventually there'll be cable channels, just like there are now. It'll just come over your internet.
Yeah. Well, I'm astonished to look at the clock and realize that we have used up our allocated time already. We've only just scratched the surface of some of these topics, but this has been great. Let me ask you kind of one final closeout question. What are you excited about? If you were going to start something new right now, or kind of guide someone to say, in terms of the world of media, this is what's new, this is what's cool, this is what's exciting, this is where the potential is. What is the plastics of our of the next era that we should all be looking at?
I'm very excited about the evolution of streaming. That's, I think, trying to anticipate game theory it out and say, where do I end up? I think that's one, is where does streaming end up? And what, if you game theory it out, what's the eventual end of it? And what will emerge out of it? And then the second thing, which I still look at, and I'm amazed, 20 years, 25 years after timing to go to a startup, in the startup.com days, I thought we'd be farther along. But I think there's so many small and medium-sized businesses that still are trying to figure out how they work in a digital age. How do they make Facebook work for them? It's a little off the topic we were initially on, but that's where what I love is, how do you take these businesses, like I worked for Highlights, small, medium-sized business, good revenue, incredible brand, but weren't really addressing the market, and we really beefed up digital for them. So I think for companies, and I'm seeing it now, I'm consulting, I am going into companies, and that's what I'm looking at, is I still think there's a huge opportunity for small, medium-sized businesses to really look at what they do and figure out, how do I use the internet? It's only 20 years old, so there's new generations. But I think that's also what excites me, is companies getting much better at using it and adapting their products, but also their selling and their marketing. So.
Yeah, amen. Couldn't agree more. Well, David, you mentioned you're doing consulting now. Obviously, you bring to that tremendous knowledge and expertise, as you've just been demonstrating with us over the last 30 minutes or so. If someone wants to reach out to you or learn more about you, where would you send them? Where should they go? What should they do?
They could look at me on LinkedIn, or my email is dgitow, Gitow, @gmail.com.
Okay. Well, very nice. Well, we'll put those and the link to your LinkedIn profile in the show notes for anyone who's looking for it. And David, thank you so much. This has been an illuminating conversation. Really appreciate your being here.
Thanks, Howard. It's been a lot of fun. I enjoyed it.
Great. And thanks to all of you as well, as always, of course, for listening to or watching the Winning Digital Customers podcast. So happy to have you. Look forward to seeing you next time. And until then, keep transforming.